June 1943, Camp Hearn, Texas. When the first trains carrying German prisoners of war rolled into Camp Hearn in the summer of 1943, the men inside were not merely entering captivity. They were stepping into a reality that would quietly dismantle everything they had been taught to believe about the United States. Most of these prisoners were hardened veterans of the Afrika Korps, captured after the final collapse of Axis forces in North Africa. Following the Allied victory in Tunisia, between 250,000 and 275,000 German and Italian soldiers laid down their arms on May 13, 1943, one of the largest mass surrenders in modern military history. Many of those men would soon find themselves transported thousands of miles away to detention camps scattered across the American interior. Over the next 3 years, their confinement would become an unexpected education. While the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, established on November 3, 1944, by Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson under orders from President Franklin D. Roosevelt, focused on measuring the physical devastation inflicted on Germany. It was psychological rather than material, and it affected the 371,683 German prisoners held on American soil during the war. These men encountered, up close and without mediation, the industrial and organizational strength that made Allied victory not just possible, but inevitable. The journey began in North Africa. At major processing hubs such as Casablanca and camps in Iran, German prisoners were introduced to the administrative machinery of the US Army. Thousands were processed each day with a level of speed and coordination that surprised even seasoned German officers. Medical screenings, identity registration, and briefings on the Geneva Convention were carried out methodically and without visible strain on personnel or resources. Yet what left the deepest impression was not paperwork, it was food. After enduring months of desert combat sustained by thin rations, prisoners suddenly found themselves eating soft white bread, drinking real coffee, and receiving meat regularly, often twice a day. This was not a staged gesture for morale or propaganda. It was simply standard American military provisioning. Their transport across the Atlantic reinforced the same lesson. The prisoners were loaded onto Liberty ships, cargo vessels produced in staggering numbers through American mass production techniques. Although the legendary assembly of the SS Robert E. Peary in just over 4 days was largely a publicity effort supported by extensive prefabrication, the broader reality was no less impressive. By 1943 to 1944, the average Liberty ship required only 39 to 42 days to build, still far faster than comparable German ship construction, which often took several months. During the 2-week crossing, the prisoners observed something that felt almost shocking: abundance to the point of waste. American sailors casually discarded partially eaten meals portions that alone exceeded the daily rations of German soldiers at the front. The ships themselves were equipped with radar and modern navigation systems that Germany still considered experimental, yet here they were installed as routine equipment on cargo vessels. Arrival in the United States only deepened the sense of disbelief. Most prisoners disembarked at major ports such as Norfolk, Boston, and New York. At Norfolk Naval Base, they encountered a facility covering more than 4,300 acres, with shipbuilding, repairs, and logistics operations happening simultaneously on a scale that eclipsed anything in the German Navy. The prisoners noted dozens of vessels under construction or overhaul at the same time, activity that, in a single day, surpassed the throughput of major German ports. The rail transport inland proved even more revealing. Instead of cramped freight cars, the prisoners were moved in passenger trains, complete with seating, dining services, and in some cases sleeping berths. Through the windows, they witnessed a country illuminated at night from end to end. Small towns glowed with electric lights. Farmhouses and barns shone across rural landscapes that, in Germany, would have been enveloped in darkness. Factories operated around the clock. Parking lots were filled with privately owned automobiles. An everyday sight in America, but an unimaginable luxury in Germany, where car ownership remained limited to a small elite. Even the prison camps themselves defied expectations. Rather than the brutal, improvised enclosures many had anticipated, the camps were orderly, well supplied, and governed by consistent rules. Taken together, these experiences did more than contradict Nazi propaganda about American weakness and decay. They rendered it obsolete. For many prisoners, captivity in the United States became the moment when the war's outcome and the reasons behind it finally made sense. The speed and scale with which the United States constructed prisoner of war facilities during the Second World War was remarkable, but even more striking was their durability and level of comfort. Camps such as Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Shelby in Mississippi, and Fort Robinson in Nebraska were erected in a matter of months. Yet they often offered living conditions that surpassed what many of the prisoners had experienced in their civilian lives before the war. By the height of the conflict, the United States maintained more than 500 prisoner of war camps spread across 46 states. With the exception of Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont, nearly the entire country participated in this system. Roughly 175 were major camps, supported by more than 325 smaller branch facilities. Depending on their size and function, these installations housed anywhere from a few hundred to as many as 12,000 prisoners. In many cases, construction was completed in as little as 90 days apace that underscored America's vast industrial and organizational capacity. The barracks themselves were modest but modern. Built primarily from wood, they were equipped with electric lighting, central heating, and indoor plumbing amenities that were far from universal in wartime Europe. Behind the scenes, the camps relied on complex infrastructure networks. Water purification plants, electrical generators, sewage systems, and heating facilities were constructed on a scale that rivaled or exceeded those found in many mid-sized German towns. Medical care within the camps further illustrated the disparity between American resources and German wartime conditions. Camp hospitals were often better equipped than civilian medical facilities in Germany. X-ray machines, fully functional operating rooms, and well-stocked pharmacies were standard rather than exceptional. American doctors and nurses administered penicillin routinely, while German military physicians struggled to obtain even limited supplies of the drug for their most critical cases. Regular medical examinations, dental services, and long-term treatment for chronic illnesses were systematically provided levels of care that Germany could not consistently offer even to its own soldiers. Food preparation and distribution offered yet another stark contrast. Camp kitchens were supplied by an agricultural system operating at full capacity. Refrigeration units, still uncommon in many parts of Germany, allowed fresh meat, dairy products, and vegetables to be stored safely. Industrial-scale gas stoves, electric mixers, and automated dishwashing machines ran continuously, enabling a small staff to prepare meals for thousands of inmates each day. Daily rations included milk, eggs, meat, and fresh produce in quantities that regulations require kitchens to prepare extra food, typically about 10% more than needed, to ensure that no prisoner went hungry. Ironically, the resulting food waste deeply unsettled many prisoners who came from a society suffering under strict rationing and chronic shortages. By late 1943, labor shortages within the United States prompted authorities to employ prisoners of war in non-military work, particularly in agriculture and certain industries. While this program helped alleviate domestic labor gaps, it also exposed German prisoners to American production methods on an unprecedented scale. On farms throughout the Midwest, prisoners encountered a level of mechanization that fundamentally challenged their understanding of agriculture. Individual farms in states like Iowa and Nebraska covered more land than entire villages in Germany. Tractors, combines, and other machinery allowed a single farmer to cultivate hundreds of acres. Advances in agricultural science, such as hybrid seed corn developed through systematic research, produced yields far beyond traditional European methods. Chemical fertilizers, which Germany desperately conserved for explosives manufacturing, were readily available for American farming. By 1943, more than 90% of American farms had access to electricity, compared to fewer than 20% in Germany. Electrification powered irrigation systems, grain elevators, and storage facilities, dramatically increasing productivity. Although specific yield figures, such as claims of 60 bushels of wheat per acre, cannot be conclusively verified, contemporary observers consistently noted that American output vastly exceeded German agricultural production. Mechanization allowed one farmer with modern equipment to perform work that would have required dozens of laborers using manual tools in Germany. Agriculture in the United States had evolved into a science-driven industry. Soil analysis, crop rotation strategies, and selective breeding programs replaced centuries-old traditions. Prisoners assigned to food processing plants witnessed automation on a scale that defied their previous industrial experience. In canneries across California and New Jersey, automated lines filled, sealed, and packaged products at volumes that would have required hundreds of workers in Germany. Electric conveyor belts and standardized quality control systems allowed production to increase even as many American workers served overseas. In industrial regions, although prisoners were barred from direct involvement in weapons manufacturing, they could not avoid seeing the outer edges of America's industrial power. The Detroit area alone possessed more automotive production capacity than the entirety of Germany. Factories once dedicated to civilian automobiles had been converted to produce tanks, aircraft engines, and military vehicles at rates German industry never matched. One facility in particular captured widespread attention: the Willow Run plant in Michigan. Visible to prisoners working nearby, the factory reached a peak output in April 1944 of one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Although this extraordinary pace was not maintained indefinitely, it demonstrated an industrial capability that German aircraft manufacturers could not achieve even for simpler fighter planes. Above all else, it was the abundance of electricity that left a lasting impression. Power was everywhere on farms, in factories, and in private homes. Consumption levels seemed almost unreal to men accustomed to strict conservation. A single aluminum smelting plant in Tennessee used more electricity than entire German cities. Projects such as the Tennessee Valley Authority transformed rivers into vast sources of power, something Germany had never pursued on a comparable scale. Hoover Dam alone generated more electricity than several German power stations combined. This surplus of energy made continuous production possible. Factories operated around the clock in 3 shifts, while civilians enjoyed a standard of living that consumed resources Germany reserved almost exclusively for military use. For many prisoners, these experiences reshaped their understanding not only of American power, but of what modern industrial society could achieve when resources, planning, and technology aligned. Italy's capitulation in September 1943 triggered an unexpected psychological rupture inside the prisoner of war camps in the United States. German captives suddenly found themselves watching a strange transformation unfold before their eyes. Italian soldiers, once comrades on the battlefield, were reclassified as cooperative prisoners and rewarded accordingly. Those willing to assist American authorities were granted privileges that felt almost unimaginable: improved housing, paid labor, relaxed supervision, and even limited interaction with American civilians. For German prisoners, the contrast was jarring. While they remained behind barbed wire, their former allies began blending, cautiously but visibly, into the rhythms of American life. The irony was impossible to ignore. Even in confinement, the conditions provided by the United States surpassed what many German soldiers had known within their own army. Adequate food, medical care, and humane treatment contradicted years of Nazi propaganda that portrayed America as morally corrupt and brutal. The emotional impact deepened dramatically during the winter of 1943. As Christmas approached, German prisoners received packages sent by American churches, charities, and civic organizations, gifts offered not to allies, but to men whose country was still actively fighting the United States. Religious services were organized in the German language. Local communities donated food so prisoners could enjoy special holiday meals. This was not an act of weakness. It was a demonstration of unshakable self-assurance. Only a nation convinced of its moral and military superiority could afford generosity toward captured enemies. Beyond material comfort, the camps became unlikely centers of education. For many prisoners, the learning opportunities available in captivity exceeded anything they had previously encountered in Germany. By early 1944, roughly 25,000 German prisoners had completed structured courses. These ranged from English language instruction and American history to practical vocational skills designed for post-war life. Major universities across the United States contributed to this effort. Professors offered correspondence courses, and visiting lecturers occasionally addressed prisoners in person. Camp libraries expanded rapidly, stocking thousands of books, including German language literature, academic texts, and international periodicals. Prisoners could read multiple newspapers freely, an experience utterly foreign in Nazi Germany, where all media functioned as instruments of state control. The scope of this educational initiative was extraordinary. University scholars delivered lectures on economics, political theory, and democratic institutions. This intellectual exposure reinforced what prisoners could already see with their own eyes: a prosperous society functioning without authoritarian rule. They were not merely observing American success, they were studying the underlying systems that produced it. This internal shift became visible through camp-run newspapers written and edited by prisoners themselves. By the end of the war, German captives had published 135 different newspapers across the camp system. Early editions often echoed rigid nationalism and denial. Over time, however, the tone evolved. Articles increasingly explored themes of reconstruction, political responsibility, and Germany's potential future within a democratic framework. American authorities allowed a level of editorial independence that would have been unthinkable under the Nazi regime. Prisoners were free to debate political and economic ideas that had long been forbidden. This freedom of thought, combined with tangible evidence of abundance and stability, proved more effective than any formal propaganda campaign. Among these publications, one stood out for its influence. Der Ruf, The Call, produced at Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, and circulated widely among camps. Edited by carefully selected anti-Nazi prisoners participating in the re-education program, the paper introduced democratic principles gradually and encouraged critical reflection on Germany's moral and political collapse. The progression of these newspapers, from defiance to reflection, from certainty to doubt, offers documented proof of a profound ideological transformation taking place behind the wire. That transformation was accelerated on June 6, 1944. News of the Allied landings in Normandy reached the camps quickly. The scale of the operation defied comprehension. Thousands of ships, vast air fleets, artificial harbors, and an uninterrupted supply chain revealed an organizational and industrial capacity far beyond anything Germany could match. Newsreels shown shortly after the invasion left little room for illusion. Prisoners understood that defeat was no longer a possibility, it was inevitable. By spring 1945, the war in Europe was drawing to a close. As American forces liberated Nazi concentration camps, the footage was shown to German prisoners. Many reacted with disbelief, dismissing the images as enemy fabrication. Yet confirmation arrived from multiple sources: American soldiers, international observers, and eventually letters from families in Germany. Denial collapsed under the weight of evidence. This final revelation completed the psychological reckoning. Germany had not only lost the war militarily and industrially, the moral foundations of the Nazi regime were exposed as criminal beyond dispute. The numbers underline the magnitude of this experience. Between 1943 and 1946, the United States held 371,683 German prisoners of war across camps in 46 states. Escape attempts totaled just 2,222, well under 1%. One case became legendary. Georg Gertner escaped from Camp Deming, New Mexico, in September 1945 and lived undetected for 4 decades before voluntarily surrendering in 1985. What occurred in these camps was not merely detention. It was an unintentional social experiment, one in which exposure to freedom, education, and humane treatment reshaped beliefs that years of indoctrination had failed to erase. Archival records indicate that the system designed to contain enemy prisoners during the war was remarkably effective. More than 99% of captured soldiers who were held in the United States were ultimately accounted for, with escapes proving both rare and short-lived. Not a single confirmed incident shows American civilians being injured or killed by prisoners who temporarily evaded custody, underscoring the overall security and discipline of the camp network. Beyond confinement, prisoners of war became an important auxiliary workforce during a period of extreme labor shortages. They were deployed across agriculture, infrastructure, and military support roles, contributing materially to the American war economy. While later estimates have claimed figures as high as 14 million labor days in farming and hundreds of millions of dollars in economic value, such totals cannot be conclusively substantiated with surviving documentation. What is firmly supported by financial records, however, is the structure of the labor system itself. Prisoners received a daily wage of 80 cents, while private employers paid the U.S. extra government 45 cents per hour for that year alone. The federal government collected approximately $22 million from prisoner wage accounts. In addition, officials calculated that nearly $80 million was saved by assigning prisoners to work within military installations rather than diverting trained American personnel. Parallel to these economic efforts, a lesser-known psychological initiative unfolded behind the wire. Under the direction of American military intelligence, a covert re-education effort meticulously recorded shifts in prisoner attitudes and belief systems. A specialized branch within the Provost Marshal General's office developed an ambitious ideological program intended to challenge authoritarian thinking and introduce democratic principles. Historians remain divided over how successful this effort truly was. Approximately 25,000 prisoners completed formal democracy courses through a fast-track initiative implemented near the war's end. Yet multiple contemporary and post-war evaluations agree that, during active hostilities, the majority of prisoners retained their original political views despite exposure to the program. The strategy itself evolved significantly over time. In its earliest phase, the emphasis lay on passive exposure, allowing prisoners access to American newspapers, radio broadcasts, films, and books. Later iterations introduced structured instruction covering constitutional government, representative institutions, market-based economics, and civil liberties. Rather than relying solely on American lecturers, camp administrators identified prisoners who were openly opposed to Nazism and trained them to lead discussions. This peer-driven approach proved far more persuasive than top-down instruction imposed by captors. Medical care within the camps became another powerful, if unintended, instrument of influence. Treatment was comprehensive and humane, demonstrating material capacity as well as ethical standards. German physicians, assigned to camp hospitals, worked side by side with American medical staff, gaining first-hand exposure to equipment and practices unavailable in wartime Germany. Psychological care, virtually non-existent in the Wehrmacht, was introduced for soldiers suffering trauma. Suicide attempts were met with counseling and supervision, not punishment, conveying a philosophy of strength rooted in compassion rather than fear. Facilities at major camps such as Camp Shelby in Mississippi and Camp Carson in Colorado rivaled civilian hospitals of the era. These installations featured operating rooms, diagnostic laboratories, radiology departments, and modern surgical tools. Penicillin, still experimental and extremely scarce in Germany, was routinely administered in American camps. Prisoners also received dental treatment, corrective lenses, and prosthetic devices, forms of care many had never experienced even before the war. Religious practice further challenged ideological assumptions carried by prisoners. Services were conducted in German by military chaplains, while local congregations donated religious texts and occasionally participated in camp events. In a regime that had systematically marginalized independent religious life, this exposure offered an alternative moral framework centered on personal dignity and community responsibility. Both Catholic and Protestant services were widely attended, with some camps reporting participation by well over half the prisoner population. Adding to this complexity, Jewish refugees who had escaped Nazi persecution sometimes worked within the camps as translators or cultural liaisons. Their presence confronted prisoners with the living reality of those they had been taught to dehumanize, disrupting long-held propaganda narratives through direct human interaction. Even routine movements outside camp boundaries became educational. Transfers and work assignments revealed the scale and integration of American infrastructure. Prisoners observed a continent-spanning railway system capable of moving immense volumes with precision and reliability. Highways linked distant regions, pipelines distributed fuel across vast distances, and logistics networks operated with remarkable coordination. Achievements realized through democratic governance rather than centralized authoritarian control. Those assigned to railroad maintenance witnessed advanced operational systems such as automated track switching, centralized traffic management, and standardized maintenance protocols that kept the network running at peak efficiency. During these assignments, prisoners also glimpsed civilian life. Housing occupied by American workers often surpassed the living standards of German professionals. Privately owned homes equipped with electricity, indoor plumbing, and modern appliances. Children attended publicly funded schools, and medical care was frequently provided through employer insurance programs. This widespread material security stood in sharp contrast to Nazi portrayals of capitalist societies as inherently exploitative. Consumer goods, automobiles, radios, refrigerators, and other household technologies were not luxury items for elites but commonplace features of everyday life. The ability of the United States to sustain such abundance while simultaneously waging a global war revealed an industrial and economic capacity that many prisoners had never imagined possible. During the Second World War, German prisoners of war encountered an American society whose internal contradictions were impossible to ignore. Racial discrimination certainly existed in the United States of the 1942 and was both visible and deeply rooted. Yet even with these limitations, American practices stood in clear opposition to the extreme racial absolutism enforced by Nazi ideology. Within military units and defense industries, segregation persisted, but it was neither total nor immutable. Prisoners repeatedly noted scenes that would have been unthinkable under German racial law. African American soldiers operated advanced equipment, worked in sensitive technical roles, and served in positions of authority. In some cases, black non-commissioned officers issued commands to white troops. In others, skilled African American factory workers instructed white employees on machinery operation. Such reversals of racial hierarchy challenged the worldview prisoners had been taught was biologically fixed. Beyond social structures, the pace and philosophy of American industry left a lasting impression, especially on prisoners with engineering or technical backgrounds. They observed a production culture in constant motion. Machinery was not kept indefinitely simply because it still functioned. Instead, equipment was frequently replaced with newer models and work procedures were revised whenever efficiency gains were identified. This relentless forward momentum contrasted sharply with German industrial habits, which emphasized refining and perfecting existing systems rather than discarding them in favor of innovation. American approaches to quality control were particularly striking. Rather than relying primarily on the craftsmanship of individual workers, factories employed standardized processes to ensure consistency. Statistical sampling, defined tolerance ranges, and routine inspections identified flaws early in production. Defects were treated as system failures rather than personal shortcomings. To prisoners accustomed to valuing artisanal precision, this process-driven model demonstrated how large-scale production could achieve reliability without depending solely on individual mastery. Gender roles in wartime America further unsettled German assumptions. Women were a visible and essential part of the industrial workforce. They operated heavy machinery, supervised production floors, and performed technically demanding tasks. While propaganda images like Rosie the Riveter simplified reality, the underlying shift was genuine. Prisoners witnessed women welding damaged ships, controlling cranes, and managing entire assembly lines. These responsibilities directly contradicted Nazi doctrines that defined such labor as beyond female capability, even as Germany itself struggled with severe labor shortages. Economic practices in civilian life also revealed an unfamiliar sophistication. Credit was not viewed merely as a moral risk or a last resort. Farmers borrowed to purchase machinery that increased yields. Families financed homes through long-term mortgages. Workers used installment plans to acquire durable goods. This strategic use of credit as a tool for productivity and growth stood in contrast to Germany's more cautious and restrictive financial traditions. For many prisoners, concepts such as consumer credit, banking-supported investment, and structured repayment systems were entirely new. Equally influential were glimpses into American research culture. Universities and industrial laboratories operated in parallel with wartime production rather than being sacrificed to it. Companies allocated resources to future technologies while simultaneously meeting immediate military demands. Prisoners with scientific training were particularly impressed by this commitment to basic research. The American belief that lasting technological dominance required sustained investment in foundational science differed sharply from Germany's focus on short-term military solutions. Organizational management in American institutions offered another revelation. Decision-making authority was widely distributed. Supervisors at lower levels were empowered to act without constant approval from senior leadership. This delegation accelerated workflows and cultivated leadership throughout the organization. The idea of managing by clearly defined goals rather than continuous oversight seemed radical to prisoners raised within rigid hierarchies where initiative was often discouraged. Labor relations reinforced this theme of cooperation. Although wartime conditions limited union activity, the basic framework of collective bargaining remained intact. Workers understood that productivity gains could translate into shared benefits. Factories encouraged participation through suggestion programs, performance bonuses, and worker committees. Such mechanisms for employee input were unimaginable within the command-driven economic system of Nazi Germany, where authority flowed strictly from the top down. Attention to worker safety further underscored the American emphasis on human capital. Protective guards on machines, ventilation systems, and safety equipment were routine. Even prisoners assigned to labor benefited from these measures. This willingness to invest in safety, despite production pressures, contrasted sharply with German practices where injury and exhaustion were often accepted as unavoidable costs of meeting quotas. Standardization across industries proved another cornerstone of American efficiency. Components such as bolts, screws, and electrical parts were interchangeable across manufacturers. This compatibility simplified maintenance, accelerated repairs, and enabled seamless integration across supply chains. German industry, hampered by incompatible designs and limited standardization, struggled to match this level of coordination. Supply chain management itself appeared remarkably fluid. Raw materials arrived without interruption. Finished products moved swiftly to their destinations. The flow of goods was sustained not through coercion alone, but through coordinated planning and institutional cooperation within a democratic framework. This logistical harmony supported production volumes that astonished observers. Finally, opportunities for personal advancement left a quiet but powerful impression. Workers attended night classes, enrolled in correspondence courses, and improved their skills while remaining employed. Education was treated as an ongoing process rather than a fixed privilege. Advancement was tied more closely to ability and effort than to class background. For prisoners accustomed to rigid social stratification, this merit-based mobility challenged long-held assumptions about how societies functioned. Together, these observations formed a picture of an industrial civilization fundamentally different from the one prisoners had known. Imperfect and conflicted, yet dynamic, adaptive, and oriented toward the future. When German prisoners of war arrived at camps across the United States, one of the first realities that confronted them was the sheer abundance of the environment around them. The American landscape itself seemed to contradict everything they had been told. Dense forests stretched endlessly, fertile farmland produced surplus crops, rivers and lakes supplied vast quantities of fresh water, and mineral resources appeared plentiful and easily accessible. These were advantages Germany had never possessed on such a scale. When combined with America's already formidable industrial infrastructure, this natural wealth made the eventual outcome of the war appear almost predetermined. Many prisoners from resource-starved Germany were stunned by how casually Americans used what seemed like unlimited supplies. Materials that were rationed or scarce in Europe were treated as ordinary commodities. This contrast alone forced some prisoners to quietly reassess the feasibility of Germany's long-term war effort. Equally striking was the sophistication of American communication networks. Telephone lines connected cities thousands of miles apart, radio broadcasts carried news instantaneously, and information flowed with a speed and reach the German system simply could not match. Prisoners were astonished to learn that ordinary citizens regularly placed long-distance calls, that radio programs delivered global news in real time, and that letters crossed an entire continent in a matter of days. This level of connectivity allowed coordination on a scale that Germany's fragmented and overburdened infrastructure could never replicate. Public health practices observed both inside the camps and in surrounding communities revealed another fundamental difference. American authorities emphasized prevention rather than ideology. Vaccination campaigns, modern sanitation systems, and widespread health education were visible everywhere. These measures protected the population as a whole, regardless of political or racial identity. By contrast, Nazi health policies had subordinated medical science to racial dogma, often with disastrous results. The American focus on practical disease control and population wellness produced outcomes that were measurably superior. Even during wartime, cultural life in the United States continued with remarkable energy. Prisoners encountered a thriving entertainment industry through radio programs and motion pictures. Hollywood released films designed to boost morale, while factories simultaneously produced tanks, aircraft, and ships. This ability to sustain cultural creation alongside total war production demonstrated a level of social resilience that Germany lacked. Some films proved especially unsettling for the prisoners. Works like The Grapes of Wrath portray poverty, injustice, and internal criticism of American society. Many prisoners were deeply surprised that a nation engaged in a global war would allow such open examination of its own flaws. This willingness to tolerate self-criticism stood in sharp contrast to the rigid censorship of Nazi Germany. Another revelation came through contact with American voluntary organizations. Religious groups, civic associations, and charitable institutions interacted regularly with prisoners. Organizations such as the YMCA, the Red Cross, church groups, and local civic clubs provided educational materials, recreation, and humanitarian assistance. What impressed prisoners most was that these efforts were not directed by the state. Americans organized themselves freely for collective benefit. This dense network of associations, largely dismantled or absorbed by the Nazi regime in Germany, formed the backbone of a functioning democratic society. As time passed, prisoners also became aware of the scale of American industrial output. Production figures initially sounded like propaganda, but observation made denial impossible. During the war, the United States manufactured roughly 300,000 military aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.6 million trucks, and enormous quantities of weapons, ammunition, and supplies, all while civilian living standards remained higher than before the war. In 1943 alone, American shipyards launched more naval vessels than Japan produced throughout the entire conflict. By the fall of that year, Allied shipping losses since 1939 had been fully replaced. These numbers were not abstract. Prisoners working near ports physically counted ships. Those stationed close to aircraft factories watched bomber after bomber emerge from assembly lines. In farming regions, they observed harvests large enough to feed entire nations. The evidence surrounded them daily, leaving little room for doubt. This accumulation of experiences triggered profound changes among many prisoners. Officers who had once sworn personal loyalty to Hitler quietly began discussing democratic futures for Germany. Hardline Nazis often retreated into silence when confronted with undeniable proof of American productive capacity. Figures they had dismissed as exaggerations proved, if anything, to underestimate reality. Individual cases illustrate these shifts, though each must be examined carefully. Walter Haustein, captured in June 1944 during the Battle of Cherbourg and later held at Camp Co, Mississippi, organized an informal camp university where he taught law to fellow prisoners. He later took part in the American re-education program and attended administrative courses at Fort Getty, Rhode Island. After the war, Holstein went on to become the first president of the European Economic Communities Commission from 1958 to 1967, playing a central role in shaping what would evolve into the European Union. Not all commonly repeated claims are accurate, however. Hans Kroll, for example, was never a prisoner of war in the United States. During the conflict, he served as a German diplomat in Turkey and Spain. His later appointment as West German ambassador was to the Soviet Union, not the United States, between 1958 and 1962. His wartime experiences differed entirely from those of the POWs held in America. One of the most controversial aspects of the POW experience was the U.S. Army's re-education initiative, administered by the Special Projects Division. Launched in late 1943 under Lieutenant Colonel Edward Davidson, the program operated in secrecy. Its objective was nothing less than transforming former Nazi soldiers into citizens capable of supporting a democratic Germany after the war. Prisoners were categorized into three groups: openly anti-Nazi individuals, roughly 10%, politically neutral or indifferent prisoners comprising 75 to 80%, and committed Nazis estimated at 10 to 15%. The program targeted the large middle group. Anti-Nazis were used as instructors and discussion leaders, while hardline Nazis were isolated to limit their influence. Educational methods were carefully designed. Prisoners were exposed to American newspapers, books, films, and radio programs illustrating democratic norms. Courses covered American history and constitutional government. Discussion groups encouraged debate, while vocational training emphasized civilian skills rather than military discipline. Information about Nazi crimes was introduced gradually to avoid outright rejection. Historians continue to debate the program's success. Around 25,000 prisoners completed formal democracy courses, but a 1946 report by the Provost Marshal General's Office concluded that the initiative did not fundamentally alter the beliefs of most participants in the short term. Yet longer-term effects may have been more meaningful. Many former prisoners later held influential roles in West Germany's reconstruction and applied methods they had observed in the United States. Although the Marshall Plan would not be announced until 1947. The foundations of German-American cooperation were already in place through the POW experience. Former prisoners returned home with first-hand knowledge that prosperity resulted from production rather than conquest, that democratic systems could generate wealth more effectively than authoritarian rule, and that treating workers as partners rather than subjects produced stronger, more sustainable outcomes. The technical advisory efforts that later supported the Marshall Plan did not emerge in isolation. They were rooted in networks of trust, shared experience, and mutual understanding that had taken shape several years earlier during the period when German prisoners of war were held in the United States. Those years created an unexpected reservoir of human capital. Many former prisoners having directly observed American industry and agriculture from the inside, later returned to Germany uniquely prepared to serve as intermediaries between American advisors and German institutions. These individuals did far more than translate spoken language. They interpreted ideas, habits, and assumptions. They explained American ways of organizing work, managing production, and solving problems to German officials who might otherwise have dismissed them as foreign or impractical. In this sense, they functioned as cultural translators, easing the transfer of knowledge. During the early years of Reconstruction, one of the most consequential areas of influence was agriculture. Before the war, much of German farming remained rooted in long-standing traditions: small family plots, reliance on animal labor, minimal use of machinery, and limited application of scientific methods. Prisoners who had worked on American farms encountered a radically different model. They saw vast tracts of land cultivated by a small workforce using tractors and harvesters, observed systematic crop rotation and fertilization, and witnessed the dramatic impact of selective breeding and rural electrification on output. Upon returning home, these former prisoners became outspoken proponents of agricultural reform. They argued for consolidating fragmented landholdings, investing in machinery, and adopting modern agronomic science. Their claims were not theoretical, they were grounded in personal experience. They could describe, in practical terms, how a single mechanized farm could produce what once required dozens of laborers, and how yields could be doubled through methods that were already routine in the United States. Resistance was fierce. Many German farming communities viewed these ideas as a threat to tradition, identity, and local autonomy. Yet the severe food shortages of the immediate post-war years weakened opposition. Hunger created urgency, and urgency created opportunity. Former prisoners who could credibly explain American farming techniques became valued contributors to reconstruction initiatives. By the 1952, the transformation of German agriculture from labor-intensive subsistence farming to modern, mechanized production owed a substantial debt to knowledge first acquired during captivity abroad. A similar process unfolded in industry. While confined in American camps, prisoners employed in factories had been exposed to production systems unlike those they knew at home. They observed rigorous quality control, streamlined assembly lines, and a consistent emphasis on worker safety. Equally important, they encountered a managerial mindset focused not on preserving established methods, but on continuous improvement. Regularly updating equipment, revising procedures, and empowering workers to suggest enhancements. When these men later participated in rebuilding German industry, they carried those lessons with them. Practices such as decentralized decision-making, goal-oriented management, and involving employees in productivity planning were introduced into factories that had once operated under rigid hierarchies. These approaches initially seemed radical within German industrial culture, which had traditionally emphasized perfecting existing systems rather than replacing them. Over time, however, they proved effective. Many of the organizational principles that fueled the German economic boom of the 1952 can be traced back to ideas first encountered by prisoners during their time in the United States. The impact of captivity extended beyond technology and economics. It triggered profound psychological change. Prisoners arrived in America having been shaped by years of ideological conditioning. They had been taught that democracy produced disorder, that racial diversity weakened societies, and that capitalism inevitably exploited workers. Daily life in the United States contradicted these assumptions. They observed social stability without authoritarian control, economic vitality driven by markets, and cooperation across ethnic and racial lines. This clash between belief and experience produced what later psychologists would describe as a form of ideological collapse. Many prisoners withdrew from political argument altogether. Others openly rejected doctrines they had once accepted without question. A widespread curiosity about alternative systems emerged, accompanied by a willingness to learn rather than assert certainty. Camp psychologists recorded these changes carefully, noting that even prisoners who retained a strong sense of German national identity often abandoned Nazi ideology when faced with evidence that could not be reconciled with it. Change was neither universal nor immediate. Some prisoners remained doubtful, attributing American prosperity to favorable geography or temporary wartime conditions. Others insisted that German methods, if properly implemented, were still superior. Yet skepticism had limits. The sheer scale of American productive capacity visible in factories, farms, and infrastructure was impossible to dismiss. Whatever the explanations offered, few could deny that the United States had achieved levels of output far beyond anything Nazi Germany had realized or plausibly could have. Formal re-education programs were only part of this transformation. Informal human contact often proved more powerful. Prisoners assigned to agricultural labor frequently shared meals with American families. Those working in factories labored alongside civilian employees. These everyday interactions undermined propaganda more effectively than lectures or pamphlets ever could. Acts of ordinary kindness, fair treatment, shared conversation, mutual respect left lasting impressions. Many former prisoners sustained these relationships long after the war ended. Letters were exchanged for decades. Visits and reunions followed. What began as brief encounters between enemies evolved into enduring friendships that helped soften post-war animosities and foster reconciliation at a personal level. Religion also played a meaningful role. Under the Nazi regime, Christian belief had been subordinated to racial ideology and state authority. In American camps, prisoners encountered religious life free from political control. Local churches that served the camps demonstrated faith practiced through voluntary participation and charitable action rather than coercion. For many prisoners, this experience revived an ethical framework that Nazism had displaced. Religious services in some camps attracted higher attendance than had been typical in German military units or civilian communities before the war. Traditional Christian teachings offered prisoners a moral alternative to the ideology they had known and a means of interpreting their suffering and responsibility. In the post-war years, a significant number of former prisoners who had rediscovered faith during captivity became supporters of Germany's emerging Christian democratic movement. Education within the camps extended far beyond job training or political instruction. For prisoners from working-class backgrounds, many of whom had received limited schooling, captivity unexpectedly opened doors. They studied English, read American literature, enrolled in correspondence courses offered by USSR universities, and participated in intellectual debates that would have been impossible under the censorship of the Third Reich. This exposure was especially transformative for younger prisoners whose entire formative education had occurred under Nazi rule. Encountering open discussion, critical inquiry, and competing viewpoints reshaped their relationship with knowledge and authority. Learning was no longer about obedience, but about questioning, comparison, and evidence. That shift would influence how a generation of Germans approached rebuilding their society after the war. After returning to Germany, many former prisoners of war chose paths that had not been available or even imaginable to them before captivity. Drawing on skills they had acquired and interests they had discovered while confined in American camps, a significant number pursued higher education and professional training. Their years in the United States had unintentionally become a formative classroom. Perhaps the most transformative lesson came from daily exposure to the American economic system. Nazi ideology had portrayed capitalism as a brutal structure built on exploitation, corporations crushing workers, wealth hoarded by elites, and economic democracy dismissed as a myth. Life in the United States challenged these assumptions at every level. Prisoners observed factory workers who owned cars and homes, labor unions negotiating contracts rather than being outlawed, and widespread prosperity generated through market-driven production rather than state coercion. This practical economic education proved especially consequential for Germany's reconstruction after the war. Former prisoners returned with a working understanding of market dynamics, consumer credit, industrial labor relations, and investment behavior not from textbooks but from lived observation. They had seen the difference between productive capital reinvestment and sterile accumulation, how credit could function as an engine for expansion rather than reckless consumption, and how rising worker prosperity strengthened economic stability instead of undermining it. Beyond economics, captivity created a cohort of Germans with unusually deep familiarity with American society. Unlike tourists or propaganda audiences, these men had spent years living among Americans, working alongside them, and navigating their institutions. They came to understand both the strengths and the shortcomings of the United States through direct, unfiltered experience. This first-hand knowledge became strategically valuable during the Cold War. Former prisoners who understood American intentions and capabilities were well positioned to counter Soviet narratives that framed the United States as an imperial aggressor. Their experiences told a different story. American power, as they had witnessed it, stemmed from productivity rather than conquest, from innovation rather than domination, and from personal freedom rather than repression. Their voices helped anchor West Germany firmly within the Atlantic Alliance. Although some precise figures related to the prisoner of war program remain difficult to verify, surviving records still convey its immense scale. At the height of the war, approximately 371,683 German prisoners were held in the United States. In total, 425,871 Axis prisoners, including Italians and Japanese, passed through the system. Camps operated in 46 U.S. states, with only Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont excluded. The network included 175 primary camps supported by more than 325 satellite facilities. Despite the vast number of detainees, escape attempts were rare, only 2,222 attempts, representing less than 1% of prisoners. Educational efforts were substantial, with 25,000 prisoners completing formal democracy courses and 135 camp newspapers produced. Remarkably, camp construction was often completed in as little as 90 days, even as the United States simultaneously fought a global war on multiple fronts. The logistical achievement alone reflected extraordinary organizational capacity. Experiences within the camps varied widely by region, offering prisoners a panoramic view of American life. Those assigned to the agricultural Midwest encountered large-scale mechanized farming and food abundance unlike anything they had known. Prisoners in the industrial Northeast observed dense manufacturing networks, urban infrastructure, and economic energy. In the American South, prisoners confronted racial segregation, an aspect that partially echoed Nazi propaganda. Yet they also saw African Americans occupying social and economic roles that would have been impossible under Nazi racial laws. Those held in the Western states witnessed the sheer geographic scale of the country, its natural resources, and the momentum of frontier-style development. Taken together, these regional impressions made it impossible to dismiss American prosperity as isolated or exaggerated. From New England to the Pacific Coast, from the Great Lakes to Texas, prisoners consistently encountered levels of industrial output and material abundance that surpassed conditions in their homeland. Professional German military officers experienced particularly sharp psychological tension. Trained to believe in German superiority, in discipline overcoming material limits, and in quality triumphing over quantity, they faced a reality that contradicted those assumptions. In the United States, they saw how material abundance itself became a strategic advantage, enabling flexibility, resilience, and sustained operations. Democratic armies, they learned, could equal authoritarian forces in discipline while surpassing them in logistics and adaptability. These officers closely studied American military organization, supply chains, and doctrine. They observed how civilian expertise fed directly into military planning, how industrial strength translated into battlefield capacity, and how democratic oversight could enhance effectiveness rather than weaken it. Such observations later influenced the formation of the Bundeswehr, West Germany's post-war armed forces, which adopted numerous American organizational principles. Technical learning extended beyond individual skills to encompass an entire philosophy of innovation. Prisoners noticed how Americans continuously sought improvement, rapidly implemented new technologies, and rewarded experimentation instead of punishing deviation. This stood in contrast to traditional German emphasis on refining existing systems to perfection before change. Those with engineering and technical backgrounds paid close attention to production workflows, quality control methods, and maintenance strategies. They recorded assembly line processes, statistical quality assurance techniques, and preventive maintenance systems. When these men returned to Germany, such insights played a meaningful role in industrial reconstruction and helped restore German competitiveness in global markets. The impact of captivity extended far beyond economics and technology. In the 1950 seconds, the transformation of former prisoners had profound generational effects. These men returned not only as workers or professionals, but as fathers, educators, and community leaders. They raised children with values that diverged sharply from Nazi doctrine, encouraging critical thinking, skepticism toward propaganda, democratic participation, and respect for human dignity regardless of race or nationality. Their children grew up hearing stories of American generosity and abundance rather than tales of decadence and weakness. This intergenerational transfer of experience contributed significantly to the pro-American orientation that defined West Germany throughout the Cold War. The cultural Americanization of the 1950 seconds and 1960 seconds rested on foundations laid years earlier in prisoner of war camps. Reunions of former prisoners offer some of the most compelling evidence of this transformation. A notable gathering in Austin, Texas in 1985 brought together more than 500 former prisoners. They returned not as enemies revisiting a battlefield, but as friends retracing the origins of their personal change, often accompanied by their families. At these reunions, former prisoners spoke openly about their journeys. Many described arriving in the United States as committed Nazi soldiers and leaving as citizens prepared for democracy. They credited humane treatment and unexpected kindness with opening paths away from hatred and violence. They expressed gratitude for conditions that, in many cases, surpassed what their own government had provided, and for an education aimed not at punishment but at peaceful reconstruction. Historians continue to debate the immediate effectiveness of the American re-education effort. Some argue that ideological change during captivity was limited, noting that many prisoners focused primarily on survival and repatriation. Yet over time, the cumulative evidence suggests that the prisoner of war experience in America left a deep and lasting imprint, one that quietly shaped the political, economic, and cultural trajectory of post-war West Germany. Some scholars argue that the long-term effects of the American program for German prisoners of war were profound, cultivating a generation more open to democratic principles and favorable toward an alliance with the United States. Evidence indicates that both the skeptical and optimistic interpretations hold elements of truth. Structured re-education efforts had minimal immediate influence on deeply committed Nazis or on prisoners whose main concern was simply surviving. Yet, the broader exposure to everyday American life, the abundance of industrial production, the functioning of democratic institutions, and the experience of personal freedom left durable impressions that shaped post-war Germany. Recent research has highlighted the unplanned consequences of these initiatives. While U.S. authorities concentrated on formal educational programs, the most lasting impact came from informal encounters, observations, and daily experiences. Ideological change was less a product of instruction and more a consequence of immersion in reality. The tangible demonstration of productive efficiency, democratic governance, and humane treatment of former enemies. The German POW experience in the United States offers enduring lessons for post-conflict reconstruction and ideological transformation. It demonstrates that modeling societal values can achieve more than propaganda campaigns, that humane treatment of adversaries can foster future cooperation, and that witnessing prosperity and personal freedom can more effectively weaken authoritarian beliefs than military victory alone. The program's success did not rely on psychological manipulation or elaborate indoctrination. Rather, it stemmed from the simple yet powerful act of allowing prisoners to observe an American society functioning at full capacity. The clearest argument against Nazi ideology was not persuasive rhetoric, but the visible evidence of a thriving, organized, and morally conscious society. This historical example underscores a broader strategic insight. In ideological contests, the most compelling tool of a democratic nation may be its own societal success. Through the POW experience, defeated soldiers who once believed in German supremacy and American inferiority came to recognize that the United States embodied a highly advanced civilization capable of defeating not only military forces but the ideological foundations of Nazism itself. Between 1943 and 1946, over 371,000 German prisoners passed through American camps, witnessing firsthand the full power of the so-called arsenal of democracy. They saw farmers producing surplus food, workers constructing the machinery of war, and civilians treating captives with respect and dignity. The true strength of America, they realized, lay not in its military arsenal, but in its relentless capacity for innovation, production, and social organization. The process of transformation was neither uniform nor immediate. Some prisoners remained resistant, clinging to remnants of Nazi ideology. Others were preoccupied with day-to-day survival or returning home. Yet the aggregate effect was undeniable. A significant number of returning soldiers carried with them a detailed understanding of American productivity, democratic governance, market mechanisms, religious liberty, and humane treatment. In many cases, these individuals became inadvertent emissaries of democratic values, disseminating the knowledge and experience they had acquired in USS camps across post-war Germany. Former POWs adopted American agricultural techniques, industrial processes, and organizational strategies while also promoting democratic governance, market-based economies, and international alliances. They raised children influenced more by these principles than by the remnants of Nazi ideology. The remarkable economic recovery of West Germany in the 1952, the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, drew heavily on insights and skills gained by these men during their captivity. They understood that genuine prosperity arose from productive work rather than territorial conquest, that democratic institutions could generate wealth more efficiently than authoritarian regimes, and that treating employees as partners rather than subjects yielded superior outcomes. The Atlantic Alliance, which became the backbone of Western security during the Cold War, was also shaped by experiences these men had in the United States. Those who had observed American strength and generosity firsthand emerged as advocates for close German-American relations, confident in the knowledge that U.S. power was oriented toward defense, not exploitation, and that prosperity could be shared without coercion. The story of German POWs in America exemplifies the enduring power of reality over ideology, of lived experience over propaganda, and of example over exhortation. Without coercion or forced indoctrination, exposure to a thriving, free, and productive society converted former enemies into allies, leaving an indelible imprint on the reconstruction and future direction of Germany. They were not persuaded by rhetoric or philosophical debate. What reshaped their beliefs was something far more tangible: reality itself. The glow of electric lights in ordinary homes, highways filled with private automobiles, and dining tables burdened with plentiful food quietly dismantled everything Nazi ideology had promised them. These everyday scenes delivered a more powerful refutation than any leaflet or radio broadcast ever could. The German prisoners of war arrived with firm expectations. They had been taught that the United States was fragile, fractured, and nearing economic and social collapse. What they encountered instead was a nation operating at an astonishing scale. An industrial giant capable of producing endlessly, organizing efficiently, and still preserving a surprising level of compassion even toward its enemies. Across farms and factories, they saw abundance on a level they had never imagined. American agriculture produced enough to sustain entire populations. Factories ran day and night, generating weapons, vehicles, and supplies in quantities that could equip not just an army but the world itself. More striking still was the social reality behind this productivity. A democratic system where ordinary citizens lived with a material comfort that surpassed the privileges reserved for aristocracies elsewhere. Perhaps the most unsettling discovery for these soldiers was not America's power, but its humanity. They encountered decency and fairness from those they had been taught to view as subhuman adversaries, treatment more respectful than anything their own regime had offered them. Guards spoke to them without cruelty. Communities treated them as men, not monsters. This contradiction struck at the core of everything they had believed. Within this quiet psychological shift lay the beginnings of Europe's post-war recovery and the collapse of the Nazi worldview. When these men eventually returned to Germany, they did not go back merely as defeated combatants. They carried with them first-hand testimony of what open societies could build when fear was replaced with cooperation. Their children would grow up in a very different Germany, one rebuilt as a democracy and aligned with the United States. That alliance did not emerge solely from treaties or military necessity, but from a deeper transformation that had begun years earlier. It started in June 1943, when veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps stepped off a train in Texas and realized that nearly everything they had been told about the world was false. The significance of the German prisoner experience in the United States extends far beyond individual change or diplomatic outcomes. It offers a broader lesson about power itself. The most effective force available to democracy is not brute strength, but visible proof that freedom can generate prosperity, that dignity can coexist with strength, and that openness can outperform control. Those German soldiers who witnessed America's industrial capacity were not merely impressed, they were altered at a fundamental level. Their journey illustrates a deeper historical truth. Some victories are achieved without destruction, some triumphs without conquest. Sometimes belief systems collapse not under bombs but under evidence. What unfolded was not a story of humiliation but of realization. From that realization emerged a foundation for a more cooperative world. One built on the understanding that free societies working together could surpass anything authoritarian systems could conceive. The German POW experience in America should not be dismissed as a minor episode of the Second World War. It stands as a pivotal moment in the reshaping of the 20th century. It demonstrated that enemies could become partners, that soldiers could later become builders, and that those who personally witnessed the success of democracy could become its most convincing messengers. In the end, this transformation, achieved not through force, but through example, may stand among America's most enduring victories of the war.